When did you decide that you wanted to open a gym, and what was the purpose of that? I would imagine it was just like, I'm going to create a place that I can train.
I was coaching out of my garage at that point for 4 years. It was out of my mom's garage. Very typical founder story that does not exist today, even in fitness, I think.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Good People, episode 66. My guest today is Eric Freedom. Eric is an author, an entrepreneur, a gym owner, and a fitness and wellness coach. In this episode, expect to learn about Eric's upbringing and his experience as his parents were going through a separation, the kinds of values that were instilled upon him from a young age, opening his gym and eventually branching out to help people with things outside of just their fitness, and much more. If you guys are on YouTube, please remember to head on down and like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on our post notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. And if while you're listening, you are enjoying my conversation with Eric, please consider sharing the episode with someone who you think would like it too. Without further ado, enjoy the show. Man, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this. I'm excited to get the opportunity to learn from you, learn your story.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Let's get started. I have been talking to a lot of people about this, and I feel like something that I've been trying to do with the show is I started it with the intention of talking to the kind of people that I talk to now, a lot of researchers, professors, regular folks, gym owners, business owners, athletes, etc. Sort of all under this premise that I think everybody has a cool story to tell. And I think that good people live good lives. And I think, it doesn't matter who you talk to. I think if you really get down to the nitty gritty and you ask cool questions, generally you can come away with something that's super important. So with that being said, I'm excited to dig into a little bit about you and your life story. And so just get me started with where it was that you grew up. What was your childhood?
Yeah, dude. Well, I am from the San Gabriel Valley in Los Angeles, California. So I'm in this like hub of a good healthy mix of like first through third generation immigrants. So there's like my town is probably like 70% Chinese, second generation Chinese now. And maybe 60%, but it's like 40. It's like if you're white, you're a minority in my town. So there's not a whole lot of places around anywhere where that's normal. So that's kind of where I grew up. I grew up in Rolling Heights, which is like 20 minutes from where I'm at now. I'm in Temple City, California, about a mile from a gym that I owned in Arcadia, which is 15 minutes from Pasadena, which is where the Rose Bowl is. So like whenever I need to explain to someone like where I'm from, that's typically the context that I give. Is about 15 minutes from the Rose Bowl. It's where all the big games are played if you're into football. But yeah, man, I am a son of two immigrant parents. I'm the first generation that was born here. I'm one of two boys. My brother is 5 years younger than me. And yeah, man, I was born and raised in LA, have never left. In the last 3 years is probably the most of the world that I've ever seen. Outside of that, before I got married, I never left LA. So LA is all I know, man. So yeah. You're Virginia, right?
Yeah, Virginia. And I was going to say, I feel like that being said, I have almost a complete opposite experience of growing up. And I also assume this is probably generational too. Like I had smartphones when I was in middle school and things like that really affected it. But for the most part, I was like white middle-class family. Grew up with the kind of white picket fence type stuff, and four kids, 3 siblings. I had several dogs at a time. Weekends doing sports and stuff. So I would imagine that there's probably some discrepancy too, and I'm sure we'll get into this in terms of the values and things like that were instilled upon you in a young age. But talk a little bit more about what was the kind of thing that you were interested in. Was it sports? Was it reading? What hobbies were you interested in as a young age? What were you pushed towards?
That's a good question. Growing up, I think a lot of my memories were kind of like blunted from a certain age. I don't really have much of them. Like, I don't really have much memory of I would say there's probably a 5 to 6 year gap where I can't remember a whole lot of my childhood. I can remember like when I was 3 to 5, not even three. I'd say like 5 to 6. So it's like I kind of have memories of like when my parents were still married. So married had me, and then their married years. Then there's like the years of them like going through separation, and then life afterwards is which mostly what I remember. Post separation. So, um, yeah. How do I articulate?
How long were they married, and what age were you when they got separated?
Yeah, they went through like I call it like an Asian divorce. So they were married for maybe like 7 to 9 years before a lot of like problems started to surface. But they always had like kind of like a turbulent, what seemed like me to like a pretty turbulent relationship growing up. So even while they were together, they would like argue a lot, and they just never really saw eye to eye on a lot of things. And we're talking like money. I mean, money's always a big one, right? Money, how to spend time, how to budget, work. Can't get into anything else that I don't know that much more about their marriage because they both don't talk about it. But there's probably like a 7 year gap where they went through that difficult period where they're married, but like separating, getting back together, separating and whatnot. And that's kind of like a fuzzy. I only really remember like pain like during that season, and then life afterwards, which was like different elements of learning how to figure out life with two separated parents. So
What age would you define that separation point where they were apart?
uh, maybe like when it was really obvious, probably like 10 years old.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like third grade or so.
And then afterwards, how was your time split up? Were you with one parent more than the other? Was it evenly
Yeah,
distributed?
so I pretty much was raised by my mother. Yeah, my brother and I were raised by my mom.
And after you were kind of with your mom, what were some of the things? Was she pushing you towards anything, or was it sort of just
Yeah,
like getting by
yeah.
type stuff?
Growing up in the culture that I grew up in, I think the things that are emphasized the most are like academics. Like, how do you do really, really well in school? Because if you do really, really well in school, your future is a little bit more set. You get into a good college. If you get into a good college, that means you might get a good job. And so there was a pretty good emphasis on academics, which I was never really like academically inclined growing up. But the things that I naturally gravitated towards were like anything that wasn't really school related, like anything that required me to sit for a long time. I wasn't really interested in. I have always been like a reader. I've always been a pretty voracious reader, as long as it's in subjects that I'm interested in. So, but yeah, like I was never had like a bent on sports growing up. Like my parents signed me up for sports just to like treat it as like babysitting. And the first sport that I really found growing up was basketball. So it was kind of as my parents were going through their divorce or their separation, I spent a lot of time playing club basketball and playing for different teams, and I definitely excelled in that. But it was really just like an escape away from reality. Um, I would say, I mean, I'm not like I grew up in a pretty affluent neighborhood. I mean, it's definitely affluent now today, but I grew up in a pretty middle upper class neighborhood, where I kind of always felt poorer than everybody else, in the sense that like we were really house poor. We could afford to have the house in the neighborhood that we had it in, but we couldn't really afford to do anything else, if that makes sense. Like always shop the sales section of like any grocery store, manager special when it came to buying really anything. And that's simply just because that's what reality was. And because of that, like, again, I have two parents that are trying to support themselves. And then I have one parent, my mom, who's trying to support herself plus her two kids, and trying to stay in a neighborhood that's not somewhere that they can afford to be, put a lot of stress on her. And as a result, she wasn't like, she didn't neglect us. And I would never say that she did, but she was doing her best to survive, and, going through your own relational problems and trying to survive and provide at the same time. Myself, she went through that around the same time, like around the same age that I am now today. I am married and I have 3 children, and it's very difficult and it's very challenging, right? And there's all the things that, and I would say that I have a great marriage. I can only imagine what it was like for her going through that alone, So yeah, I gravitated towards sports, and I had like as a way to kind of like just it's something that was mine that didn't belong to anybody else. Um, but yeah, that's kind of my upbringing a little bit.
Thanks for sharing that. And something that I have come to learn kind of recently that I think is relevant to bring up here is I interviewed Dr. Monica Kirkpatrick Johnson several weeks ago, and she is a sociologist at Washington State University, and she studies the transition from adolescence to adulthood.
Mm,
And basically breaks down and wants to find out what are the characteristics that contribute to having a successful transition into adulthood,
mm,
defining what a successful adulthood looks like.
yeah.
And obviously, a lot of it from a research perspective comes down to socioeconomic status, just because it's a predictor of health and happiness and well-being and adventures and all of the things that are required to live a good life in today's day and age, at least in our Western world, usually comes down to socioeconomic status. And think like middle class above, right? Is usually what we're shooting for. And something that was interesting to me is that she has pretty much said and told me that education in and of itself is pretty much the only thing that we should be worrying about making sure that our kids get. It's our kids need to be educated because that will ensure that they are at a socioeconomic status that will allow them to achieve all the other things and have a successful adulthood. And so the reason why I bring this up is because like I too came from an environment where school was pushed pretty heavily on us. And like, luckily for me, I've always been an amazing student. I had like a 4.3 GPA in high school, and I almost had a 4.0 in college. Like I've always done well academically, not necessarily because I liked it. I did, but I was just good at it. I'm good at test taking. It was good for my brain. Um, and I know a lot of kids aren't like that, especially I think in the world that you and I work in, where there's a lot of these like coming up with sports and getting pushed towards the athletic endeavors more so. But the reason why I bring this up is because I think it's an important thing to point out that I think there's a lot of people out there that sort of neglect or regret the relationship they have with their parents because they were pushed. School was pushed so heavily on them, and they had other interests or other areas, but it wasn't misguided, and they're just like wanting the best for you. And something I think that is important to add too is what Monica was telling me about is that we just, especially Americans, don't do a good enough job of explaining other paths. Like, when I was in high school, all the kids that went to like trade school, electrician school, mechanic school, we kind of thought they were the dumb kids and made fun of them, but they were just had different aptitudes and wanted to work on different things. And that's just as good as going to college or going into the military. And her whole point was parents should do a better job of keying into their children's interests and aptitudes at a young age, and then pushing them in the direction that seems like the best fit. I thought that'd be valuable to add, especially because I know being a dad is so important to you.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, one of the things I think about as you share that is, if there's anything I feel like my mom did really right was she always advocated for. Although academics were important, they weren't like for her. They weren't the end all be all. Even though I grew up in a culture where it was heavily valued and heavily pushed, right? I graduated from high school thinking I was like really dumb. Uh, I graduated with like a 2.4 GPA. I could like my freshman year of high school, I had like a 1.6 GPA. They called me into the guidance counselor's office and asked me if I was like suicidal or depressed. Right. And during that year, my parents were going through the divorce. So like I was just having a tough time in life in general. Right. And academics just, when things at home aren't going well, you don't think school is that important at 14, 15 years old, you know? But as I went through that, one of the things like when I think about is regardless of what I went through, my mom was always really supportive of like whatever dreams I had. She would always say like, just go after those with like your whole heart. Right. And what I realized was when I graduated high school, I went to junior college, my first semester, I'm like retaking classes that I took in high school, and I was getting straight A's without even trying at junior college. So that's like the only reason why I actually transferred from junior college with like a near 4.0 GPA, like a 3.8 something, while working 30 hours full time. And I finished my associate's degree in 3 semesters instead of 4. Right. And I took a semester off just to work. And I was like, oh, but it's only because I grew up in such a competitive environment growing up, where I thought I was lower than average, which I felt definitely lower than average. And for many reasons, I felt like I didn't fit in and whatnot. But when I entered like quote unquote, like either like a bigger community of people or a bigger market, I realized that I was probably a lot smarter than I thought I was. But it also built in me like a chip on the shoulder, and in a sense like a layer of humility to be like, oh, look, I'm not very smart, so I better work really, really hard, you know. So it kind of developed some grit in me, and I think that there's like a magic pill there where I feel like, not to say that I have it all together, but I think the magic pill of like coming from that environment and being able to um, not just survive that, but find different ways to thrive, and having like a nurturing mother like the one that I have today, where like she wouldn't say that, she always jokes that um, I'm overly confident because of the praise that she gives me, and like she like laughs at it. She thinks she jokes that I'm like really arrogant as a result, but it's really only with her, you know. So
Mm.
I think that that's an interesting combination that sets somebody up to become like an entrepreneur or like a leader or a coach of other people, where you can combine. It's almost like she unlocked a layer of me by just giving me belief. You know.
Yeah. I have two things on that. Number one, I think it's interesting that you bring up basically what you were comparing yourself to was a higher standard, and in doing so, you didn't like you were so young that you didn't realize that there was, you were in an environment where that standard was a little bit higher. And I too have a similar experience because I was in two main friend groups when I was going through school, and it was a bunch of athletes that I was in my neighborhood, and then like two of my best friends were co-valedictorians of my high school, like super smart guys that went to governor's school, like had a bunch of college credits before they even graduated high school. And I almost had these two direct comparisons, and I don't think I acknowledged this at the time, but I definitely do now looking back, where I always felt like an idiot when I was around my smart friends. And like to the point where I was like, man, like they are legit smarter than me, and there's nothing that I can do about it. But then I was also really close with a bunch of guys that I wouldn't say I was necessarily smart. I was smarter than them, but it was just more like the athlete kind of like they were doing dumb stuff, and I wasn't above it, but I was able to recognize, where there were certain shortcomings or whatever. And I think that it gave me a really good perspective on my aptitude and kind of what you're saying, where it was like, I don't need to have it all figured out. I don't need to be the smartest person in the room. The humility from the friends that were smarter than me, but also the belief in that, I can make something of myself. I can do this because of the other group of friends that I have. The other thing that I wanted to bring up with you is you mentioned that your mom sort of didn't have this end all be all belief on academics. You probably can speak on this better than I do, but I think it's pretty common knowledge that especially a lot of Eastern Asian philosophies and other things like that are or not philosophies, Eastern Asian cultures and environments to grow up in are very high pressure in terms of the economics. I think you mentioned it. Were you aware of that during the time? Like, did you know that it was uncommon for your mom not to be putting so much pressure on school?
At the time, I did not. I did not at all. I didn't think. I thought like my mom. You know, you have no context of your mom outside of your own mother, right? So no, I did not at all. But in hindsight, I do realize how different she is, and how she really tried her best to set me up um, to be successful in like kind of my own way. You know, she was she would always say stuff like, you know, like, you could be really good at school, and I want you to be really good at school, but like, I mean, and can I cuss on this
Yeah, you can say whatever
podcast?
you want.
Okay, so you know, it's like, but in other like in no other words other than like, she would say something along the lines of um like, but if you like come out like, if you're an asshole, like, it doesn't really matter if you're smart, or if you're intelligent, or if you're, you know, if you're top of your class, like, your character matters more than anything, you know. And that's something that like really ingrained in me at a young age, where even though I didn't grow up specifically with any type of religious beliefs, or like, our family doesn't have any kind of that background, she always really emphasized character, you know.
Mm,
she
yeah.
she emphasized being a good person, you know.
Yeah.
So
Thanks for the callback.
yeah.
When,
So
when did fitness enter the picture for you? I know obviously like
yeah.
the sports were there the whole time, but when was it this
Yeah.
direct focus on the training?
So this is kind of a crazy story. So I don't know how many stories you're ever going to get like this on the Good People podcast, but the way that fitness entered into my life was, this is like, I'm like indicting myself saying this, but when I was growing up, I actually like really wanted to kill my dad. Like I legitimately like wanted to take his life. I had a really poor relationship with him. I was just upset, angry at what he did to my family, or what I felt like he did to my family at the time. And I was not above like I said it multiple times to my mom, and I hated him, you know. And as a result, my dad was a eighth degree black belt growing up, right? So he could fight, like he could definitely kick my ass.
Do you
Um,
know in what martial art?
yeah, kickboxing. So he could definitely like destroy me. And so I developed this complex of like, well, then I need to get like really strong. So I just like started doing push-ups every day, and I think like I like fit my body physiologically responded to like I wanted to become bigger. And I'm not a big guy. I'm like 5'8". And at the time I think I was bigger than like a lot of my classmates. I had an early growth. I've been the same height since I was 11, right? So for me, I think lifting weights and doing resistance training was like a way to get bigger and get muscular. And I felt like if I could just get stronger than my dad, then I would be able to defend myself and defend my family. So the root of like, it wasn't really about fitness. It was just about strength and being better than. And that's really the context in which it started. Whether it was for good reason or not, I mean, it kind of evolved. You know, it kind of it went from that, and then my natural tendencies were like I wanted to study kinesiology. So then I went to when I was in junior college, I was an athletic trainer, and I was helping with injuries. I wanted to be around athletes, and through that, I transferred to a school in which the first year I got in, they got rid of the athletic training program, so I switched to kinesiology major and had a strength conditioning focus. And then through that, while I did that, I found CrossFit, which by way of like a professor saying, don't do that. You know, like that's not scientifically backed. It's like not, it's a grassroots cult movement. You definitely shouldn't do it if you're taking your major seriously. So naturally I decided to, go do that. And, yeah, so, you know, that's kind of like my journey into fitness. I have not always been uh, I didn't like wasn't like a value in my family. It wasn't something that like health wasn't an emphasis for my family. In fact, like I would say I'm probably the healthiest person in my family. If you're looking at health as a big picture macro view. Um, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I would say that that's probably the most honest and vulnerable thing anybody's ever said on the show.
Yeah,
I'm sure you've probably unpacked this with a therapist or something. Yes.
absolutely. I've written a book on it. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, well, I don't know if you've ever read the book. Have you ever read the book Iron John by Robert Bly?
No, but I'll write it down and please send it to me afterwards.
Okay. It can be kind of a trudge to get through, but if you're into reading, it's fine. It basically is why I'm bringing this up is because there is a phenomenon that happens with young men, and I'm sure you know this at this point, but like killing your father is usually done in a proverbial way, but it's a very normal thing that young boys turning into men go through. I was a creative writing minor when I was in college, and I wrote an entire poetry portfolio literally titled How to Kill Your Father. And
No
which is
way,
which
bro.
is crazy. Yeah, and all of the poems were sort of um talking about the same idea, which was going through some sort of rite of passage or going through some life changing thing as a young boy turning into a man. And I always attest my version of killing my dad to the first ultra marathon I ever ran was a 50-mile race. And to me, that whole journey was like the way that
That's
I
crazy.
separated
Yeah.
myself from my family and specifically my dad. But the whole book, Iron John, is on that whole process. You know, what is the type of initiation that's required, the actual pieces that go into separating yourself from your family. And it is super bizarre that everybody sort of goes through this at some level. Like it's especially in America, like I remember being like 13 at my neighborhood pool with my next door neighbor, and his dad would be in there, and we were like, let's get him. Like, we're going to wrestle this guy. And it's the same thing. Like, there's for some reason this weird psychological thing that at a certain age you want to like overcome the strong guy.
Mm.
And I guess in your sense, yours
Primal,
was just,
man. Yeah.
yeah, it was much more real in that sense.
Hmm.
With fitness entering the picture, you kind of brushed over it, and I'm curious more specifically on how that evolved for you over time. Like I would imagine, I know being a dad is important to you, and that's sort of like this thing that is as of late, but going into school, doing kinesiology, finding CrossFit, doing that, take me through that time period of your life a little bit more to
Yeah.
just point out like what was the point of CrossFit at the beginning and what has it evolved into now?
Oh man, I mean, I was like everybody else. I went through the you were probably like in eighth grade or something like that, but
What year was
I,
it?
2009.
Dude, I was 9 years old in 2009. I was like, how old is it? What is that, like
You're 9
fifth
years
grade,
old.
sixth grade?
Yeah, so you're like in fifth grade at the time when this is like CrossFit is like kind of gaining. So it's crazy because you probably don't even know a world without CrossFit then.
You're right, dude. I found CrossFit in 2019. It was when I was doing my 50-mile training. I wanted to find a
Wow.
workout methodology that was a little bit more efficient on time.
Which is interesting because like that's on the downtrend already of CrossFit, but that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah. So for me, I back in the day when you went through like a typical kines program when you're becoming a strength coach, the school of methods were pretty clearly drawn out. Like, are you a kines major?
No, I majored in communications.
Communications, right? Okay. So like, when you start learning about strength training, there's like very prototypical books that you go through, essentials of strength conditioning. You're probably definitely going to read Mark Ribiteau, starting strength. Yeah, you're definitely going to read Charles Poliquin stuff. So like, there's a kind of like the Godfathers. You can like pick up any kind of books you can get on the Bulgarian method, the Russian methods, because it was like these are like the long-standing things that you can learn about strength conditioning. Um, and I was kind of like a zealot. I was super into it. I wanted to change the way that people trained, and CrossFit was something that was just like really took my life by storm. I wanted to bring it into the traditional strength and conditioning world. So before I opened a gym, I was like my goal is to be like a collegiate strength and conditioning coach, right? Like, like a typical D1, one spot at the top of the totem pole. You have like 15, you have like probably like 3 or 4 assistants per sport working under you. And it's something that it's a world that I wanted to be in, which I'm glad I'm not in now because it's a very difficult world to be in. And you have to love the team or the sport or something to be able to have longevity in it. You have to love never being home. But yeah, so I went from CrossFit is like bad dogma uh to it is the only way to train and everything else is wrong. You should never do curls again and you should only eat paleo, uh to kind of like forming where I'm at now. And it's been many years and different thoughts here and in between. And I definitely view health a lot more holistically now. I think for many years of my life, I personally was very driven by competing, like in fitness, right? Which is totally weird when you think about it. Like when you think about competing in CrossFit, like you're literally like competing and exercising, right? It's like it's not even like
Exercise
you're running.
racing.
Yeah, you're exercise racing, which is like how do you from someone that's coming from outside of this world, how do you measure exercise racing and balance that with training using exercise, right? It's really really strange. And like if you're training, then should you even really go fast? And there's all these arguments about that. But yeah, I've gone through kind of every up and down you can in the CrossFit world. um I would say that like my practice and um, the world that the world that we're trying to create here locally is one where it's very focused on we focus on five pillars. So my personal coaching practice we focus on five pillars, and then in our gym we focus on specifically like 5 factors within those pillars of health. And I think um, those are definitely things that I thought about before. Like I spent my 20s spelling like Bengay. Like when I was your age, I literally spelled like Bengay and Tiger Balm 24/7 because that's what recovery was to me. It wasn't about sleeping because who has time to like sleep as much as I can? Like I'm out here trying to get fitter. The time that I'm awake, I should be focused on getting fitter and training more. And I would do whatever I could within a legal limit to try to be the fittest person possible. But that's because that's what my working definition of fitness and health was at that period of my life, you know?
Mm.
And now it's definitely very, very different. So
When did you decide that you wanted to open a gym, and what was the purpose of that? I would imagine it was just like, I'm going to create a place that I can train.
you know, I was 25 years old. I was coaching out of my garage at that point for 4 years. So I had a one car garage stall that turned into all three garage car stalls. It was out of my mom's garage. Very typical founder story that does not exist today, even in fitness, I think. Literally a one car garage stall, paid rent on that, and just built a business out of that, like kind of not trying. And then at some point, it kind of just outgrew the garage. But I was also, living in LA, it's really expensive. So like being a trainer and being able to survive on that was really, really difficult. So I started a gym for kind of multiple reasons. The first one was I was doing real estate at the time, and real estate was just completely trade for my time to try to make as much money as I could in the time that I was doing that. I had zero fulfillment in doing that. It did not make me feel alive. It was just simply about trying to get ahead. So I was miserable doing that. So I number one, I wanted a job where I like loved showing up to, and I loved coaching. Number two, yeah, it was absolutely a place that I could work out and train at. That was my own. And back then, at the time, like people like you did not exist. You could not go to a CrossFit affiliate or a micro gym and be like, "Hey, I'm a coach looking for a job. Can I build full time here?" Most gym owners themselves were not able to work in their gyms full time. They probably had day jobs, and then most people's gyms were kind of like side hustles. So that didn't even exist back then. Third, I was passionate about coaching people, and I almost with cultish belief wanted to share with people what I believe would give them a healthy, happy life. And I wanted them to be able to experience what I was experiencing in my own personal life. And for free if I could, but if I needed to figure out a way to charge for my time and whatnot, and it was an outlet for me to have influence on people and change my local community for the better.
You obviously also now too, you mentioned the 5 pillars, like you have a big emphasis on helping people outside of just building their physical capacity. There's like a lot of the mental, emotional, spiritual, whatever well-being that goes into it. When did you decide that this was something that you also needed to help people with? Was it at the very beginning, or did you realize later on
Yeah,
that you were missing the mark somewhere?
that's a great question. I would say it definitely didn't exist in the very beginning, right? In the very beginning, it's like, oh, dude, you should just do like thrusters and just do them heavier and faster, and you gotta
Faster
eat more.
equals happier.
Yeah, faster equals happier. And if you eat more, everything was more. So if you eat more sweet potatoes, like you just got to be more committed. Like you're just like you shouldn't be that into all those other things that you're into. If you really want to be healthy, you should only be into this, and that kind of works by sheer volume, right? If you spend the majority of your time thinking about the things that you're eating, being very intentional about that, and optimizing every minute that you have to exercise or spend time on the recovery from the exercise that you were doing, like you're probably going to be a pretty fit human being. But then I started to realize like how alone on the island I was with that. Like even if I was like a brink regional athlete, which regionals doesn't exist anymore, but like even if I was like it would be like a semifinal today, right? Even if I was like a top
I'm
500
not that old
athlete,
or young, man. I know what regional
okay,
is.
regional, okay, yeah. So even if I was like a top 500 athlete, like even if I was a top 1,000 athlete, I think what we didn't realize at the time is like you're so far away from the average person already. Like even though like to me, I'm looking at these, I'm comparing myself to like Rich Froning and like games athletes, thinking that I'm not doing enough. But compared to like the guy that works a desk job, like you're pretty much a professional athlete. So I think realizing that there is this huge gap, and if it was my goal to get everybody to be as fit as I was, I think there was something missing there. I also think there was something missing in like I started to realize that I think I myself wasn't really that whole of a person, right? Like I was super, super fit, but like I was broke. 3 years, like 18 months in, my wife's still paying the majority of our bills. I think 18 months into owning my gym, I barely drew like a $500 a month check from a business that I owned. And I'm working full time, like 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. But most of the money that I'm grossing is going to take care of the expenses of keeping the gym itself open, because I had no sense of any financial, uh, uh, I had no financial principles other than like a couple of Dave Ramsey books that I had read. And some Chinese mom principles that were passed on to me of like, never max out your credit card, never spend money that you don't have, always save more than you can, always spend less than you can save, like just like really Chinese/Jewish um, upbringing. Like, I mean, like if you're like Chinese, Indian, or Jewish, like you probably were raised with that principle, or like if you don't exercise those beliefs, your parents will cut you out. Um, so I was raised with those like really conservative beliefs about money, and because of that, like I was able to live. Like I never felt like I was poor, even though I was making $500 a month, because what I had a really rich life and freedom doing things that I wanted to do. You know, but I think eventually realizing that like, hey, like this isn't very sustainable. Um, so financially, that wasn't. It was also killing my. I think, in many ways, I think being that person it was killing my mindset. Like I it was all or nothing in one thing. And I had a really hard time hanging out with people that didn't share a similar mindset about training. And I was kind of becoming like a gym bro, it's like, and I started to see that in myself. Spiritually, I don't think I was very healthy. I was, I'm a Christian, but I think at the time, like I saw God as like a genie. It's like, oh, like God bless me with more fitness so that I can make the CrossFit games, and like there was a little bit of like what can God do for me, versus like who am I in this bigger picture of this world and this bigger story that I'm actually one really small part in, or I'm like this, I'm a vapor in this little story, and just like really realizing like where I was at was a huge game changer for me.
Why do you feel like it's so important to help other people with the things that are outside of just the fitness now?
Because I think like I've coached at this point. So I've done the math on this. Like I did the census in 2019, so it's been 5 years now since we did this. But in 2019, I pulled out the census for my city that my gym is in. At the time, it was like 59,992 people. So rounded up, it's 60,000 people. And I thought to myself, if I really, really want to make an impact in the city, you ever hear the term like 10% of the people do 90% of the work or something like that?
Yeah, it's like it's the Pareto principle, sort of.
Yeah.
It's the 80-20 rule.
Yeah, but it's like 10% of people do like basically all the work, right, of anything.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, okay, if I can influence 10% of the city or like of my local town, then that 10% can have even stronger influence on the rest of the town, right? So I took that number and okay, that's 6,000 people. And I was like, okay, what's like the most amount of people that could help in a year? I was like, okay, maybe let's call it 200 people, like 200 new people per year. Okay, if I multiply that by 10, that's 2,000 every decade. Okay, it's a 30-year mission. So in 30 years, I can literally, in my lifetime, I can say that I created something that really changed my local community for the better, right? And that kind of became the mission ever since. But how that came about was at that point, I think 2019, we were 6 years open at the time, right? We opened in 13, right? So at that time, I've been coaching for about a decade at that point. I would say that at that point, what I realized was you're going to get people to a certain level of fitness and they're still going to have problems in their life. I can like shockingly, actually, I wrote this down yesterday. I shared this with you. I think it was Chris Wilkes, but he said, by the way, your setup super reminds me of Chris Wilkes, but and it is really good, so it's a compliment.
Thank you.
But he said
pretty
that
much I've done this whole podcast based off of modern wisdom. So
really okay. Well,
yeah, I just copied his script. You know what's funny? And this is an aside, but he started literally how I started, and like there was just he was doing CrossFit. No, he's doing CrossFit, and like he was with a buddy, and they were like, "Hey, you want to start this podcast? You'll produce it, and I'll be the host, and then we'll just like split everything 50-50 and see what happens." And dude, he like interviewed one of his first in his top 10 interviews, his first 10 interviews rather, he did Dave Castro and Dan Bailey.
Killer. I didn't know that it started off as a CrossFit podcast.
It wasn't necessarily for CrossFit, but he was like a CrossFit guy, and he was in a gym. And
I did not know that.
Yeah,
he's like an Englishman, right?
Yeah, super handsome guy.
Super handsome guy. So shout out to Chris Wilkes. But he says, and I don't know if this is his quote, because I know he tends to quote a lot of people, but says, attaining something worthwhile is often going to be difficult, but just because it is difficult does not mean it is worthwhile. And that's what I wanted to share is like, people get to a point of like, oh, look, I got a 6-pack. I guarantee you that 99% of us that get to that 6-pack are going to say, and then what?
Yeah.
Right. And not to say that to take away from the difficulty that it wasn't, not to say that that's not worthwhile for that individual person, but the majority of us never wanted a 6-pack because they actually wanted a 6-pack. They wanted a 6-pack because they just wanted to like themselves more. Mm-hmm. And what I realized in about a little over a decade of coaching people, a little over 2,000 people at this point, is that most people think that they have one problem, but those problems are intertwined. Like the spiritual, the mental, the physical, the financial, and the emotional are all connected, and I started to see that in my own life, like I probably made more money. Like I make more money today than I ever have in my entire life. And I'm at a point where I probably can't retire. Like I still need to work if I want to maintain my lifestyle, but I could definitely like stop working and just like live somewhere cheaper for sure. Right. But then for me, it's like work was never about, like work in the very beginning was about survival. But now work for me is not about work anymore. Work is about showing up and doing something. Like if I won the lottery today, I'd still be on this podcast with you tomorrow. Like I would still be the same things that I'm going to do because I have a mission in my life. And I think what most people are looking is looking for meaning and purpose and looking for something that makes themselves feel like they matter and the things that they're doing matters and they feel like the things that they belong to matter. And fitness is one part of that. Like it's really, really hard to think through those things when you're not a healthy person, when you're sick and you're not well. It's really, really hard to think through those things when you don't have some money in the bank, right? When you're scrapping by to provide food and shelter for yourself, right? But most of us, and this, I didn't mean for this to become like a money podcast or anything, but for most of us, depending on where you live, I'd say like individually, if you're earning $80,000 plus, most of your problems are not going to be money anymore. They're going to be something that you think money can fix, but it's really just figuring out like who it is that you are, what is it that you want, and what are the things that matter to you, and living a life that's in accordance with those things. Like, are you who you say you are? And most people that come to our gym or come into a fitness space like ours are looking to answer that question, right? And fitness is usually just the tip of the spear where they're beginning to ask these questions. And then once they knock off one thing, it gives themselves the space and the bandwidth to ask the next question.
That's a very Western thing, by the way, to isolate a problem down to one specific thing. And like you see it in Western medicine, you see it literally everywhere. And dude, like the gym is a super easy example. I can't tell you how many times because of the fitness world right now where people come in and they're like, I think I have a muscular imbalance. And then I'm like, okay, well, let's unpack this a little bit type stuff, And very rarely, and I usually always try to explain it in this way, like very rarely is anything, whether it's your body or your finances, just your well-being, going to come down to one single thing that we can pinpoint, that we can fix, that will make everything better. And all things exist as a cohesive unit that needs to be treated as such. And I think of all those things that you mentioned, like the physical health is obviously super important, but it doesn't really mean anything if you're mentally unwell and you're financially unwell and you're spiritually unwell. And so it's very important, I think, to look at the whole picture when it comes to wellness. I just had a podcast episode with Isabel Meyering about this. And I think it's just an important point to bring up and to, obviously end on. I know you got a heart out here, but I think if more people could realize that the quick fix that they are eyeing and focusing in on is just one piece of the puzzle, it would make the long-term process way better, because it is important. Like you can't be out of shape, right? You can't not focus on your spiritual and mental and financial health, but you have to be able to focus on those things among other things. And by having this hyperfixation on one thing at a time, I think just leads to like a life of unfulfillment. With that said, man, is there anything that you want to add before you peace out of here?
No, man. I mean, this is. I'm actually. I have more of a question for you. Why the Good People podcast?
Why name it Good People?
Yeah.
I actually didn't stumble upon this until I did the show for probably like 6 to 8 months. When Cayman's my producer, when him and I were going back and forth about making the show, we used ChatGPT to try to come up with a bunch of names, and I just like wasn't jiving with anything. It was a lot of like surface level, kind of cringy, like warrior type stuff that I wasn't super into. And I don't know. I think this was actually one of the only moments that I've ever had in my life where I was just like not necessarily an epiphany, but Good People came into my head, and I was like, that's the podcast. And I texted Cayman like, hey, what do you think about this idea? Sort of like beating around it, because I didn't want him to just like shut it down. And then over the next several days, I was just kind of like, we're going to name the show Good People. And after doing the show for a while, I just sort of stumbled upon the verbiage and thinking about it, that I think that good people live good lives. And this is very similar to the conversation we just had. I feel like I have the same conversation with a lot of people over and over and over again on the show. And it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And this is very in line with a lot of philosophical ideas that I abide by, and I think a lot of other people should too, is that all that we're doing in life that's different, whether you're focusing on your fitness or your health or improving your finances or getting better at a video game or drawing a picture, insert literally any path or craft or task, those are all just methods. And there are like 5 basic underlying principles that can be applied broadly to all of them. And if you apply them well, you will do anything that you put your hands on well. And I think that that's the case for living a good life, is that if you're a good person, you live a good life. And if you focus instead of on the, how am I going to do this thing? How do I want this to work out? If you focus on coming back to those basic principles that I was just referring to, I think you will be happy and fulfilled, and you'll do a good job, and you'll do good work, and you'll provide for your community, and you'll do all the things that are required to, when you're done with this thing, be happy with the go that you gave.
Bruh, my guy's 24 years old. Let's go, man. Let's go, dude.
All right, man. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, brother.
Thank you guys for listening to this week's episode of Good People. Make sure you head on down to the show notes below to check out Eric's Instagram and all of the content and things like that he is putting out. If you guys are on YouTube, before you head out, remember to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on our post notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. If, while you were listening, you enjoyed my conversation with Eric, please consider sharing this episode with someone you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.